I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to come and speak here. I'm going to speak from a very different realm to what has been discussed till now. I think I'm going to talk from a practitioner's perspective. So we've heard a lot about science, we've learned a lot about sort of potential constructs. However, I'm going to talk about what all of us can actually do on the ground and share some of the experiences from work that we've been doing in India. Basically working with poor, vulnerable communities. So just assume for a moment that there is no climate change. Okay, so we've been sort of explained to the contrary. We have been sort of, people are trying to sort of advise us that climate change is happening. Let's just assume that nothing's happening. Okay, now there are still vulnerable communities. There are still vulnerable populations. If you actually strengthen them, make them more resilient, even if there is no climate change, you actually have enhanced social welfare. Okay, and that's the perspective that we come from. However, we take in contrast to a lot of skeptics, we actually take the fact of climate change very seriously, and therefore we design interventions or work with communities where we see major change potential happening on the ground as well. Just to tell, because lots of people ask me, what is ASEM, what is ASEM, what is GIZ? So I just put this slide up yesterday evening, and GIZ, I work for a company called GIZ, and I don't want to give the German sort of expansion of it because most of you won't understand it. It's a German government-owned enterprise. We work in more than 131 countries around the world, and we have more than 15,000 people who work with us worldwide. And India has been a partner of this, this German development cooperation for the last 50 years. We are based in New Delhi and we work in more than 21 states. The technical sort of areas of work are sort of related to, most of them are actually related to climate change. And this program that I represent is implemented jointly with the Ministry of Environment and Forests, Government of India. And we sort of, as I already mentioned, work on behalf of the German government. Okay, so let's start with this sort of initial. I think I thank Professor Rajiv Sinha, who in his sort of first sort of right in the beginning, he actually talked about coastal zones as a major vulnerable area in India, and we have been working in the coastal areas since the last 6 years, ever since the tsunami happened, and we have sort of expanded some of the work that we do in the coastal villages. There is, of course, a lot of resource dependency. There is high exposure. Now, this might or might not be related to climate change, but it is a fact that they are exposed to a lot of sort of extreme weather events. They have very limited adaptive capacity. So they have very limited capacities to face these challenges. And lots of work is being done. However, there is still a lot that can be done. And when I talk about sort of how we work, I'll also show you how there are major gaps which can actually be filled by the scientific community as well. So as a result of all of this, there is extremely high vulnerability in the coastal communities in India. And the idea of our sort of interventions is that we want to reduce this vulnerability. So you have exposure, you have sensitivity, which has these sort of impacts on the communities. And of course, you want to, at one hand, you want to reduce the potential impacts. However, at the same time, you want to increase adaptive capacity, okay, which will combine to have some kind of impact on reduced vulnerability. So I don't want to sort of get into this sort of fact file about what we do. However, there are two modes in which we work, and I'm going to talk about both of them simultaneously. One is this sort of fast start mode, because there are certain things that you can do immediately. And so the entire idea is to do something for these communities because they're facing this stress on a regular basis. It's not as if the stress is far away, like it's not 7 billion years away or even 7 million years away. There are communities right now in India which have actually been, for instance, in the Sundarbans, there are communities which just don't exist anymore. They have been submerged underwater. There are communities in Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu which are just missing. They don't exist anymore because of rising sea levels and rising, sort of intruding water from the sea. So this is a fact that exists now. And we don't need, and I can actually show you movies about people who talk about how there was my house, but it's under the water now. And there was my temple, but it's under the water now. Okay? So this is already happening. And the idea is that these two modes are one where you do quickly certain things. However, you have other modes where you actually work in a planned manner over a period of 3 to 5 years. So these are the two sort of approaches that sort of are on the slides right now. The idea is that you cannot work sort of in communities without thinking about the state level sort of. The problem is, of course, lots of people highlighted this data gap. So there's very little data at the level of, well, fine granularity. So if you're at certain sort of spatial and temporal levels, there's very little data. When you go to a community, there's hardly any data at the level of a village on what has been its past sort of experience with climate change, what has been, like basic climate variables, they just don't exist. Okay? So how do you bridge this gap? One possibility is to look at technical solutions, and these are not sort of, these two approaches are not mutually exclusive. One approach is look at technical solutions, get the data, scientific data. However, this has to be coupled with information which can be gathered from the bottom up. Okay? So there is a lot of information which is embedded in these communities. So this entire issue of globalization, the idea is you need to work with local solutions as well when you actually want to have any impact on this issue. Climate change or climate science or sort of all these debates at COP, all these COPs, what ultimately the decision has been, you need to start from the ground. If you want to make a difference, you need to go to a village or a city and plan and do certain things on the ground if you want to make them more resilient to future climate change related events. Of course, so the idea here is that you look at community level impacts, you look at regional impacts, and then you sort of try and mainstream it into the national policy processes. And this is the approach that we have, where we actually talk about enhanced awareness amongst communities. You start doing pilot activities, and thereby enhancing the increased resilience. And of course, at the same time, there is some kind of poverty alleviation and sort of creation of jobs, because you can actually tie up certain schemes like this NREGA into this climate change adaptation activities as well. Yeah? Okay, so in certain cases, of course, you need to do things very quickly, because, for instance, if a community is losing land every month because of sort of erosion, what do? You just can't say, oh, well, we'll wait till the next COP and the decision taken by the state governments or the central or the national governments, and then we just don't act. And then by that time, if you disappear, so be it. So in some certain cases, you need to actually do things very quickly. And you work with the local communities, you sort of assess their vulnerability, you look at their interest, and in most cases, wherever we have worked till now, all the pilots that we worked on, almost 30% of the funds have actually come from the communities themselves, because it's real interest. They are losing land. They're losing sort of their animals because of a next extreme event. So if you have a disaster relief shelter, there are major benefits that they obtain from this activity. So they are willing to put in money as well, and sort of we put some of the money from the German government and other sources. The idea is that you need some kind of, when you start talking about, because there's a lack of scientific data, when you go to a community, you have this sort of a bottom-up vulnerability and needs assessment. You sit with the community, you have focus group discussions, and I'll show you some pictures later on. The idea is that you train the local NGOs, you work with them, then you train them in the entire methodology of how to conduct a vulnerability and needs assessment, and then you go and implement these pilots and develop these scientific documents. There's some sort of scientific documents which are actually prepared as well. The outputs are basically sort of some of these, like the LAG, as we call it, is the local adaptation guide. So you basically a document which clearly specifies what are the risks, what are the vulnerabilities, and so you just don't stop there. And I think that's a big difference from other kind of work that is being sort of talked in the last one and a half days, that you can talk about sort of what is the vulnerability, what is the what kind of challenges already exist. However, as a next step, what we also define sitting with the community is what should we do about it now? What can we do about it now? And then we define these pilots sitting with them and saying, okay, let's A, B, C, D prioritize. Some of these things need to be done immediately. Some of these things need to be done in 3 years' time. Some of these things need to be done in 5 years' time. And then you need to find resources for doing these activities as well. In terms of sort of what you do is if you want to work with communities, you need some kind of a scientific background for doing this. You do sort of resource mapping. You actually use various tools like community timelines, seasonal calendars. you do a transact walk. So basically, I don't know if you sort of are aware of it, but these are sort of standard tools which are available for doing social research, which results in certain sort of data which can be used for planning in the community as well. You have, of course, focus group discussions, and then you do like sea level monitoring, so with distance to the shore. The other idea is for longer term projects where you sort of do not have this urgency in some sense with immediate challenges. You can actually define these projects in a much larger and sort of uniform way, a holistic manner, where you have issues related to capacity development. So, of course, all of us are talking about climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation. How do you communicate it to a person who can't read or write, who's actually getting affected by it on a daily basis? Okay? So that's a major challenge, and this is where we've actually developed very nice tools where you actually go to a community and you, through their local channels, like through a street play or through a song that you develop, you actually convey this message, this complicated message of climate change. Lots of people can say, oh, I just don't understand what is happening to the climate. But what these people need to understand is that there are certain changes. And they already know. They just don't know the language for it. They already know that cropping patterns, they have themselves changed cropping patterns in the last 10 or 15 years. They have themselves had lots of adaptive measures because of sort of the changes that have occurred in the temperature. They're already doing it. They just don't know the language for it. And what we do is we actually talk to them and work with them and try and make them understand what is happening sort of in the broader global scenario as well. It's not really relevant for them to talk about whether America agrees to be a part of the Kyoto Protocol or not. What is relevant for them is how do they adapt to the changing environmental circumstances and to the changing sort of climatic conditions around them. So what we do is we actually look at these vulnerability and needs assessments, and then as a result of those vulnerability and needs assessment, we define certain actions, and then we implement those actions in these villages as well. So we have this entire sort of go to the logical sort of extreme of doing something on the ground which has been decided by the community that it is going to enhance their sort of enhance their resilience capacity. This I don't really want to go into because this is more sort of how we design our interventions, and I think this is a difference between sort of a regular scaremongering or sort of regular advocacy campaigns which may be run by certain NGOs. What we try and do is have a very scientific approach to the entire exercise, and we say, okay, you need certain steps. What are you trying to achieve with this entire effort? It has to be clearly thought of when you begin this exercise. And this is sort of achieved through sort of what we call an impact chain. When you look at these outputs, what are you trying to produce from all this work? How does this output will be used to enhance the resilience capacities? What are the indicators for actually measuring that you have some of these outputs which are being used? And then what outcome are you getting, and what are you trying to achieve as an impact? Now, just sort of an aside on this entire idea of climate change adaptation, disaster risk mitigation or management, and climate change mitigation. I think most people sort of are not very clear about it. And the way we talk about it is that our focus, since we work in rural poor communities, our focus is on adaptation. To actually say that these communities should start mitigating their impact on climate change would be neither ethically right nor sort of technically possible. They already have such low carbon footprints. To start talking about how these guys could actually reduce their carbon footprints further would be quite a stretch. But what we say is that whatever we do as far as adaptation is concerned, it should have co-benefits as far as disaster risk mitigation or climate change mitigation is concerned as well. So for instance, if you want to introduce street lighting in a community which has regular disasters, because that always helps in them sort of trying to make sure that they find the right place to go to, you should have certain the street lighting should not be should ideally be provided using solar. And this is this is a very basic example, but this is how you can have certain adaptive measures which can actually have sort of mitigation impacts as well as sort of disaster risk management impacts as well. In terms of vulnerability and needs assessments, I said that we follow a pretty structured program where we look at community and city profiles. You look at sort of what is the general climate data, and this is where we actually struggled quite a bit because there's hardly any data. And then you combine it sort of with information from the bottom up. So how do communities perceive what is happening in their sort of neighboring environment? What is happening to their sort of climate in the past 5, 7, 10 years? And you have these discussions with the communities in various groups. You have focus group discussions with the farmers. You have focus group discussions with the sort of fisher folk. And you try and come to a certain kind of a sort of, as a result of these sort of needs, what do they think should be done now so that their vulnerability could actually be reduced? And then sort of we also looked at certain other sort of projections related to disaster risk reduction as well as energy and climate protection. Then, as I said, we actually don't leave it there. We just don't prepare this document and say, okay, now you go and do whatever you want to with it. We actually work with them in sort of defining certain pilot measures or initiatives. So you look at sort of, what we do is we actually ask them to prepare a document which is like an expression of interest. They want to do 3 pilots. Okay, so maybe something related to water management, maybe something related to disaster proofing their sort of communities, and then sort of look at certain eligibility criteria. So we actually have a pretty detailed eligibility criteria which has issues related to whether it addresses the adaptive capacity, because a lot of these vulnerable communities actually have ridiculous, sort of, in some cases, ridiculous demands as far as we are concerned, but they're very genuine demands because they have a lot of development-related issues. And that's something which most people who are doing climate science would not understand. They'll say, okay, but this is a regular development issue. You should request the government of India or the state government or even your local MLA to provide this to you. However, there are certain things where there are clear climate-related risks, and that is why we actually have a pretty detailed eligibility criteria when you have to define these pilot projects. So this is just sort of a screenshot of one of these pilot lists, and you have these different people who sort of, well, it goes on to maybe 150 lines, this Excel sheet, which actually looks at very detailed sort of selection criteria for defining the pilots. So one would sort of, what could be the examples of these pilot projects? And this is where I would emphasize again, this is where the communities themselves put in money as well, because they really care about some of these assets that are being created, because they have been destroyed over a period of time because of extreme weather events or things like that. So, for instance, they are strengthening of existing bunds. This is a community in Tamil Nadu. You have strengthening of existing bunds. You have renovation of ponds, which actually leads to better catchment area as well as rainwater harvesting. You have casuarina plantation, which actually serves as a very good shelter belt if there is a next cyclone or a sort of a hurricane. You have, in addition to that, you have soft awareness measures and climate change adaptation. So you do a lot of capacity development and awareness exercises, and you leave with the community an adaptation guide for the future, which they can use to request further such measures to be adopted by other state authorities or other sort of local area authorities. Another example is sort of what we did in Andhra Pradesh, for instance, where you're actually talking about sort of renovation of agricultural ponds. Then you're talking about sort of check walls against floods from the Buckingham Canal, which actually runs all through Andhra Pradesh, and the example on sort of improving the existing soils which have been salinized because of malpractices, excessive groundwater usage, or even when the sea comes in or when there is a surge, the water actually enters into the agricultural land and it becomes saline. So then you can actually treat the sort of soil. You actually have to flush out a lot of this salinity, and combined with our sort of soft awareness measures and local adaptation guides. And this is a link to a video. I'm not going to show it here because I don't have any time, but you can visit and see this. The entire approach, as I mentioned, the adaptation approach is actually developed by the German Federal Environmental Agency. It's called a climate navigator. How do you actually sort of, and this is being used pretty much all over Germany, and now we have adapted it to the Indian context as well. The idea is, of course, and just as a caveat, of course there are data gaps, and these need to be filled up, but you can actually use some of these approaches to develop vulnerability and needs assessment for large cities. And that's something that, for instance, in Vizag, in Vishakhapatnam, we are already doing it. We're working with the municipality of Vishakhapatnam to develop a vulnerability and needs assessment using the same methodology. So you have like the basic sort of overall approach. You talk about climate change basics, you talk about climate change adaptation, and then you go into identifying and evaluating key development sectors. What are the key development sectors which are existing in that sort of location, and what are the potential climate impacts? Then you look at what are the sort of options, adaptation options, and then sort of in cities, there are sort of already resources available from the central government as well as state governments. So we do not provide any funds to implement these measures. We just develop these measures. And then some of these measures could actually be implemented as identified in the sort of adaptation guides. The idea sort of course, is it's a nice picture. We call it the capacity development butterfly. It's actually based on the sort of quality assurance, the EFQM principles, European Foundation on Quality Management. And what we do is that you actually need to look at a holistic capacity development approach. You can't just look at, okay, I'm going to do certain measures in a village and then just forget about it. You need to work with state governments, you need to work with sort of local authorities. So you need organizational development, you need human resource development, of course, network development, and this is sort of part of this exercise that we are in today, that we are developing this new network amongst practitioners as well as sort of scientists, and then of course systemic development in the policy field as well. And this is my last slide, and I'll end here. As I mentioned sort of already, you need local sort of approaches, and this is something which is going to be more and more pronounced as sort of things become, so I'm not talking about a doomsday scenario, but the idea is if you actually want to use the climate lens to just alleviate the problems which are there in communities, it's a very convenient tool to use given the current policy climate as well as the current sort of policy rhetoric that's happening. And I think we should take advantage of it. Some of us might not agree that climate is changing. Some of us might believe that sort of these communities might benefit from climate change. The idea is if there are communities which are vulnerable to climate change, you can actually go down to them and start doing a lot of really good work. And this can actually be scientifically sort of enhanced in a big way as well. And that's where sort of, I'm a trained economist. I sort of always get excited when I go to a community and say, okay, I can do so much more when it comes to sort of collecting data, sort of measuring impact. I just don't have the time because I'm busy implementing projects. But I therefore would like to invite some of you to actually come to these communities and look at how you can work in some of these communities to look at certain issues related to vulnerability. And some scientists are already doing it. IISc, Ravindranath is already working in sort of the Sundarbans. And there are other people who are also working in these northeast areas and coastal Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. And I think there's more need for doing such kind of work. The idea finally, and I would not like to sort of spend much more time, it's important to actually look at a combination of measures. Of course, when you go to a community, the first time, if any of you go there, or I'm sure some of you have already been to such vulnerable communities, the first thing that interested is when you go to them is, so what am I going to get out of it? You will come and do a scientific assessment, but what do I get out of it? And I think, so when you go to a community, you actually raise expectations quite a bit as well. And you have to be very careful on sort of how you enter a community. And that's why it's important that whenever such sort of initiatives are planned, there is a package, a holistic package which is offered to a community. When you talk about, I'm going to do it. I as a scientist or you as a scientist are very interested in doing assessments and trying to come and maybe get a sort of a nice publication in a good journal. The idea is, of course, the community would also be interested in getting some benefit out of this sort of this assessment that you've done. They would also like to see what measures have been defined as a result of the work that you're doing. How can you support them in getting some kind of funding to do the work that is already happening? Not only money from outside the country, but from within the country as well. And therefore, it's very important that sort of there are multidisciplinary teams. And I was glad when sort of Professor Sinha mentioned that there is already a group which is existing in IIT Kanpur, which is sort of multidisciplinary. But I think there also needs to be more interaction with people who have access to finance, who have access to certain technologies on the ground, which could actually be involved in doing this kind of implementation of projects on the ground. And of course, you guys as students could actually be involved in more and more of this kind of work. Thank you very much.